Hello and welcome back to Buffalo Plaid. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. I'm a professional historian who specializes in the history of the American frontier and the North American conservation movement. I'm the author of 7 books, and you can catch me every week on the INSP series, Into the Wild Frontier. We've been looking at the history and legacy of the very first hunters of the modern era in the 18th century. That includes both European settler hunters and the Native American hunters that they lived and hunted alongside. And we've been focusing on and talking about all of the things they used every day in their lives, things that really we take for granted today. We're looking today at powder horns, particularly how they carried their powder and most importantly, how they kept their powder dry. Many of these hunters would not go hunting for an afternoon or for just a day, but they are often engaged in what we call the long hunt, or they were long hunters. Amongst the most famous long hunters in history were Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton. These hunts would usually entail not days, but weeks of hunting. And these men were experts at keeping themselves alive. They were really the very first survivalists in American history. They were okay without shelter. They could do okay without food. They knew how to find these things. They knew how to make these things. But the one thing they would never ever bend on was letting their gunpowder get wet. If they couldn't shoot their gun, then that was really, quite literally, a matter of life and death. So having a substance and having a material available that can both be easy to carry, readily abundant, and keep your powder dry was essential. And that brings us to the powder horn. Now, gunpowder has been around for hundreds of years, long before the age of the 7 Years' War, or the American Revolution, or Daniel Boone, or America's founding era. But what was fairly new in that time was the idea of carrying your powder in a horn. Now, before that, many marksmen would actually carry their powder in individual charges, and they would call them charges. I have here an example, maybe sort of an artist's representation of a normal charge made out of river cane. And you can see what it would have looked like. River cane is a wonderful material for carrying powder. Number one, it stays very dry after you do your part and dry out the material. And number two, river cane is self-dividing at different parts in the cane itself. As the cane grows, it installs its own cap, if you would. So here we have a cork covering a small charge of river cane, and you can see it's empty. This would usually be enough for one shot, and a hunter might carry 4 or 5 or even 6 of these. In Europe, some soldiers carried 12 at a time for any given hunt. They weren't going into war, at least not one they anticipated, but the charge itself was one of the original ways of carrying your black powder. If you're a modern muzzleloader hunter, as I am, you're going to recognize this, because here we have what is essentially the exact same technology, right? Holding one charge, one shot, and one round of ammunition that we use here into the 21st century. I know we think we feel very advanced in the 21st century, but the reality is, we are really reading the book that they wrote. These 2 devices here are something that, if traveling in time, anyone from the 18th century would most certainly recognize today. So we haven't come that far. But what is really an American innovation, what is really uniquely American at the time, something that people in Europe simply did not use for carrying gunpowder, was the powder horn. Now, a couple things about the material of horn before we move forward. This material was the plastic of the 18th century. It's been called that usually a lot whenever you talk about the material, but everybody says it because it's true. This material, when heated up, can be shaped and molded into almost any use you can imagine. And throughout human history, although they haven't used it for gunpowder, people used horn for a lot of different reasons. Horn has a lot of different layers to it. You can peel back one after another. And as you peel the layers back, horn becomes smooth and shiny. In its original form, as you can see here we have raw horn. This is an incredibly sort of rough looking material. It's not terribly attractive, but you can see from what's ahead of us, the different levels and layers of the horn really show that there's a lot to peel back here before you get to a very beautiful, smooth interior. And horn was used for a lot of different purposes. The more you shaved it, or the more you kind of skimmed the inside, the more translucent it became. In ancient times, people used it where they would normally use glass, as far as lanterns and window panes. It was labor intensive, but again, when heated, usually with hot oil, you would find that this is a really nice material that you can shape, and most importantly, it's thermoplastic. It would keep its shape. So by the time we get to the 1750s in the New World, we have groups of people emerging that are becoming known as horners. And these are people that can take a cow's horn, a bull's horn rather, and they can really manipulate it and shape it and inscribe it into some really beautiful creations. This is a great material for carrying black powder, not just because it's easily molded and nicely inscribed, as we'll look at, but most importantly because it's watertight. There's one thing you have to understand about black powder, is that if it gets wet, it will absorb all of the moisture around it. It loves water. It drinks it in. And water is death to black powder because it just won't shoot and it won't ignite no matter how much you do. And many, many, many hunters have had their, the game of their life escape their clutches because their gunpowder was wet. So what's really useful about this, again, is not shaping it as a material, but it's waterproof, which is really the key that made it so useful. Again, people really only carried powder horns for a period of about 1750 to about 1800. Once you got beyond the year 1800, we moved on, technology developed better. We didn't carry powder horns anymore. So when you're talking about this, understand this is a show talking about the history and the legacy of the American hunter. This is something you'd really only see from an American hunter, whether they be of European descent or Native American descent. It's a moment in time that's survived over the years. Now, I have several examples of powder horns in front of me. Here's one we have. That's a modern powder horn, but it gives you a really great idea of what these would have looked like. You would take the bull's horn. It would be filled with lots of nasty biological, stuff that you would need to clear out of it, remnants from the animal itself. But it was an abundant resource. I mean, these are people on the frontier that never wasted anything. And they certainly weren't going to waste any part of an animal that was usable. So the way you would typically do this is you would leave this in a pile outside, maybe a pile of manure or leaves. If you can avoid getting in there, digging that stuff out, you probably would. Let nature take its course. It'll clean it out for you. But it would give you a nice hollow structure you could use. The end of the horn, you can see here, the business end of it, we'll say, is really thick and really dense material. Again, bulls will use this for competition, for fighting, and for mating, and so on. So they're going to need something that can take a real shot. And for the horner, one of the first issues they'll face is taking this part of the horn, which is more or less solid all the way through, and as I remove the plug, drilling it out. And you can see that goes right in there. This is solid material on the powder horn, but as you move towards the edge, it becomes hollow completely. It's a perfect vessel for really carrying gunpowder. But the horner would have to drill that out, saw off the edge and drill that out. And they actually had equipment to do that. Equipment we think of as industrial equipment, machine shops of the 18th century. After you have that hole drilled out and you have the horn cleaned out, you just need to cap it or plug it with a wooden plug. These plugs were held in place by these brass pins, and you can see them going all the way around the horn. And with the use of some beeswax on the interior, beeswax is nature's great sealant, this thing would be waterproof reliably and safely to let you go on a hunt, not just for days, but as I mentioned, for months. Now, key in on the brass tacks on these horns, right? You've heard that phrase before, brass tacks. Brass is an essential part of this horn. Because the thing about brass is, and one of the reasons that brass will ultimately replace the powder horn, is that it's non-reactive. It won't spark like other metals would, like steel or iron. Because if you have a pound of black powder on your hip and you have a spark, you're in big trouble. You belong to the history books, I think we can say at that point. So brass is critical. You'll never get a spark out of brass. Not great for shooting the weapon, but ideal for carrying the gunpowder. You'll see these horns will hold usually from about a half pound to a pound of gunpowder, depending on the size of the horn. This is a smaller horn. This is a modern horn, so it's sort of mass-produced, and it was cheap. So you're not going to have a big horn. Some horns were much larger, even twice as long as this one. This one's inscribed with an image of a fortification of the 18th century. Again, this is not a work of art. Some of them are. But these were done by hunters who were trying to kill time, or soldiers who were standing around, right, waiting for the day to pass. So they're generally very rough. You can see this one is inscribed with the year 1754. Again, this is a modern horn. 1754 being the year that Fort Duquesne was constructed. So we clearly have an image of Fort Duquesne on this horn, and we have the bands and inscriptions going through that denser or thicker part of the horn. We have another example of a horn here, a little bigger. You can see the shape is a little bit different. I like this one a lot. It has on it a directional star showing north, south, east, and west. Again, this is all done with just a bored soldier with a knife. And here we have a representation of an ear of corn with pretty accurate images of what the roots of an ear of corn would have looked like. So these kind of horns were, here we have a turkey foot on there. These kind of horns were generally works in progress. Very few of them were done when the master had a vision. Most of the time soldiers would just add things on as they needed to, or bored hunters in the process. But absolutely, whether you're talking about a Native American hunter from the Shawnee band, or the Ojibwa band, or the Haudenosaunee, the Great Iroquois Confederacy, or you're talking about a Scots-Irish frontiersman, men like Daniel Boone or Simon Kenton, these long hunters gone for very vast stretches, they will cut corners on a lot of things because they can survive in the wilderness with just what they have. But the one thing they would not cut corners on was keeping their powder safe and dry. Now, what if you weren't going out for a long hunt? What if you were just going out for, say, a day or two? You don't need a lot of gunpowder for that. Men would have carried at that time what they call a pocket horn. And here's a really good example of one. It's designed to fit, as you could guess, right into your pocket. These were generally designed the same way. Take a normal bull's horn, soak it in hot oil to soften it. They would press it down to flatten it. As you can see, the shape is very different. And then they would, again, drill out the end, and you'd have a powder horn plugged and tacked that would only hold, maybe a quarter or so of what a much larger horn would hold. You wouldn't need that much if you're just going out small game hunting for rabbits or squirrels or even just a day for turkey. You wouldn't need that. So this would be a really great example of a day's hunt and what an 18th century hunter might use to keep their powder dry. Same design, same mechanisms, same idea. How far have we come? What does the future look like? Well, here is a modern muzzle loader's powder flask, we'll say. It's made of plastic. It's roughly the same size as this one, and made of essentially the same thermoplastic material, this being an organic material in horn, this one being plastic, but it serves the same purpose. So one of the reasons I love to study the history of hunting and the history of the outdoors in America is because the North American conservation model is so different than anything else you see in Europe or Asia. It is who we still are when we take to the forests. Understand, as modern hunters, we are generally hunting in the ways that Native Americans taught the first European settlers who came here. We're sharing the same methodologies, the same strategies and tactics that they used. And again, even though our tools have changed a bit, they're really not that different. Hunting is a real tangible connection to the past, something that it's so hard to find in the modern era. And I think as historians and sportsmen, we really need to take that legacy seriously and pass it on to the next generation. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brady Kreitzer, and we'll see you next time. Out.